Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. This one is going to be pretty fascinating. We're going to be looking at how randomness can actually create order and complexity in nature.
It's kind of a head scratcher, right? You think of randomness as chaos, but...
Yeah, like the enemy of order.
Right. But we've got these excerpts from scientific texts we're going to dive into. And, well, it turns out this organized chaos shapes a lot of things. I mean, everything from how, like, bacteria even find food to how our brains are wired.
Really? So like the most basic organisms to some of the most complex structures in the universe.
Yeah, it really kind of flips the script on how we usually think about biology.
Yeah, well, I'm intrigued, so let's jump right in. The text starts off with a pretty captivating example. It's a bacterial chemotaxis.
Yeah.
So you know how even bacteria, like tiny single-celled organisms, they're able to move around and find nutrients with like surprising efficiency?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's actually pretty clever how they do it. They basically use what's called a biased random walk.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm following.
Well, imagine it like they're playing this constant game of hot or cold with their environment.
Okay.
So they sense these tiny changes in like nutrient concentration around them. And that guides their movements.
So they don't have like a GPS or anything?
No complex map, no intricate calculations. It's just sensing what's good and a bit of randomness to explore their surroundings.
So that's all it takes, just kind of stumbling around, but with a slight preference for the good stuff.
Pretty much. It's like the ultimate minimalist approach to problem solving, nature at its finest. And this whole idea of using randomness for efficiency, well, it pops up again and again. It's not just bacteria, this thing, it's how our brains develop too.
Whoa, okay, hold on. Our brains, you mean like the things that make us?
Yeah.
Those are shaped by chance too.
To a surprising degree, yeah. It's pretty wild. So think about how neurons develop. You know, they branch out, form these intricate networks. Well, it turns out a lot of that growth is actually a pretty noisy process.
Noisy? Does that mean like there are errors in how our brains are wired?
Not errors exactly, but a lot more randomness than you'd think. So, for example, when neurons grow these branches, they're called dendrites, right?
Right.
Well, they don't follow some perfectly predetermined blueprint. They do this thing called dendritic self-avoidance.
Okay. And what is that?
It's essentially these branches, they repel each other.
They repel. Like they don't want to be near each other.
Right. It's like they're trying to get as much space as possible so they can spread out and explore more territory.
Wow. So it's like they're programmed to connect with everything BUT themselves.
Yeah.
Like why would that be helpful?
Well, think about it. This repulsion, which is driven by like random interactions at the molecular level, it's crucial for creating those complex, interconnected networks that make our brains so adaptable.
Okay, I'm starting to see the logic here.
It's kind of like if you're scattering seeds to plant a field, you want them spaced out right, so they each have room to grow.
Right, so even at the level of individual neurons, randomness is helping to build a more robust and flexible system.
Absolutely. But it gets even more interesting. How does nature use this randomness to create more organized structures in the brain? Or even our entire body?
Yeah, that's a good question, because we're not just a jumble of randomly connected neurons.
Right. So the text highlights this mechanism called notch signaling. And it's kind of like a cellular game of chance.
The game of chance.
Yeah, basically the winner cell in this game gets to determine what happens to its neighbors.
And this creates order.
Yeah, through what seems like a totally random process. Imagine a grid of cells, all identical at the start. Through notch signaling, one cell in each area randomly wins and becomes a specialized type of cell.
Okay.
Its neighbors then become something else. And boom, you've got this perfectly spaced grid pattern, like a blueprint for building distinct organs and tissues, including the brain.
So that's how we go from a bunch of identical cells to like a heart or a lung, a brain. Wild. It's like nature's using randomness to create a framework for complexity. But okay, what about the actual connections between neurons? How do they find the right partners to create those functional circuits? Is it all predetermined, or do those chance encounters come into play again?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. That's where this whole idea of synaptic matchmaking comes in. It's like this big puzzle. How do neurons find the right partners?
Right, because it can't just be random, can it?
Well, it turns out it's kind of a mix. Early on in development, there's a lot of what you might call synaptic promiscuity. Neurons aren't too picky about who they connect with.
So like a synaptic free-for-all?
Pretty much. There are even cases where isolated neurons form connections with themselves.
Wait, so a neuron can connect to itself? What's that called?
They're called autopsies, like if you can't find a friend, be your own friend kind of thing.
Right, but that can't be the whole story, can it?
Of course not. There are also specific molecules that act as these matchmakers. They guide neurons towards the right partners using like chemical signals and stuff.
Okay, so it's like a combination of chance encounters and some guidance along the way.
Exactly. But then the question is, how does the brain refine all these initial connections? I mean, it starts out kind of chaotic, right? How does it create the precise circuits we need?
Right, because we're not just walking around with these randomly wired brains.
Definitely not. And this is where the idea of cells that fire together, wire together comes in.
Oh yeah, I've heard that before.
It's often called Hebbian learning. Basically, if two neurons frequently fire together, the connection between them gets stronger. And if they rarely fire together, the connection weakens.
So it's a use it or lose it principle for our brains.
Exactly. But get this, randomness comes into play here too.
Really? Again?
Yep, Carla Schatz, she did this amazing research on the developing retina. She found that there are these spontaneous waves of activity, like random bursts of neural firing that sweep across the retina.
Hold on, you mean before we're even born? Before our eyes have even seen light, our retinas are already firing.
It's crazy, right? And these random waves, they're what drive the fire together, wire together process.
Okay, so explain that to me.
So picture two neurons right next to each other in the retina. When a wave of activity comes along, they're more likely to fire together, which strengthens their connection.
Okay, I get that. But what about neurons that are further apart? Couldn't they also fire together by chance just because of these waves?
That's where the random direction of these waves is really important. Because the waves come from different directions, only those neurons that consistently fire together, regardless of their distance, will maintain strong connections.
So those that fire together only occasionally, just because waves happen to overlap at that moment, those connections will weaken over time.
Precisely. It's like this natural filtering system, making sure only the most meaningful connections stick around.
So it seems like randomness, in this case, is ensuring that only the strongest, most relevant connections survive. It's like sculpting the brain, in a way.
It is. It's shaping the way we process information before we're even born. And this isn't just in the visual system either. There's evidence for this kind of process happening throughout the brain.
It's incredible, really. It's like randomness is built right into the algorithm of how our brains are built. But so far, we've been talking about individual neurons or small groups of them. What happens when we zoom out and look at entire brain regions? How does this play out on a larger scale?
Well, for a really cool example of large-scale organization influenced by randomness, we can actually look at the insect world. Specifically, the fly's visual system.
Flies. I wouldn't have thought they'd have much to teach us about complex brains.
I know, right? But trust me, it's fascinating. Their visual system is based on this thing called neural superposition. It's remarkably sophisticated. They've got these compound eyes with tons of individual lenses, and each lens uses multiple light-sensing elements to create this really precise map of the world.
So even though their brains are tiny, they're processing visual information in a super advanced way.
Exactly. But all those light-sensing elements, they send these long nerve fibers called axons back to the fly's brain. And all those thousands of axons, they have to be sorted with incredible accuracy to create a coherent image in the fly's brain.
That sounds like a logistical nightmare. How did their brains manage to do that?
It's the million-dollar question, right? And while we don't have the complete picture yet, we know that randomness plays a role. There's evidence that these axons, they don't just follow a predetermined path. They actually exhibit a degree of random movement as they grow.
So they're like tiny explorers, making their way through this intricate network.
That's a great way to put it. And it's likely this exploration, guided by molecular cues, of course, but also shaped by chance, that allows them to find their correct targets in this massive wiring diagram. It's pretty remarkable. It really shows how even the most precise biological systems seem to benefit from a little bit of randomness.
It makes you wonder why nature would even bother with all this variability. I mean, wouldn't it be easier to just hardwire everything perfectly? Wouldn't that be more efficient?
It might seem that way, but there's another side to this story. And that's the power of variability itself. Think about it. The world is constantly changing, throwing curveballs at us all the time. A perfectly optimized system, while great in a stable environment, would be super vulnerable to any kind of change.
So this randomness, this inherent variability in development, is what makes us adaptable, more resilient when things change.
Exactly. It's like nature is hedging its bets. By creating a range of individuals with slightly different traits, some will be better suited to one environment, others to another. And that diversity, it increases the odds that at least some will survive, even when things get unpredictable.
So it's not just about surviving, it's about being able to thrive in a world full of unknowns. And this applies even to individuals with identical genes, right? Like identical twins.
Absolutely. We used to think identical twins were basically clones, but more and more research is showing that even they have differences, from fingerprints to things like their susceptibility to diseases like schizophrenia.
So even starting with the same blueprint, the randomness of development can lead to pretty significant variations.
It's true, and it really highlights a key point.
Mm.
We need to move past the simple nature versus nurture way of thinking. There's this inherent randomness in development, this element of chance that contributes to each individual. It's part of what makes us unique, even if we have identical genes.
So it's not just genes or environment, it's this complex interplay. And chance is right there in the mix, playing its part.
Wow.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how much of who we are is already set from the start and how much is because of these random little events that happen when we're growing up.
It definitely adds another layer to this whole nature versus nurture thing.
Yeah, for sure.
And it brings up some really interesting questions, too, like about what it means to be an individual. If randomness is so important in biology and how our brains are wired, how does that affect things like free will? I mean, do we really have as much control as we think?
It is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it that way. Like, even if we knew everything about someone's genes, everything about their environment, we still couldn't predict exactly who they would become.
Right. Because there's always this element of chance.
It's like even in a world with all these laws of physics and biology, there's still room for things to be unpredictable, for things to happen spontaneously.
It's true. And that's maybe what makes every single person truly unique.
So maybe randomness isn't a bad thing after all. Maybe it's actually crucial. I mean, it's what allows for individuality, for adaptation,
Yeah.
for the incredible diversity we see in nature.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. This kind of randomness in development, this variability, it's what allows species to be resilient. But it's also what lets each individual within that species be unique.
So what's the biggest takeaway you hope people get from this deep dive?
I think it's the importance of accepting that things are complex. We always want simple explanations for everything, but it's just not how the world works. Our brains, our bodies, who we are, it's all this mix of genes, environment, and these random events that happen along the way.
And this randomness, this variability, it's not just some kind of background noise. It's actually a source of creativity, a driving force in evolution. And in the end, it's part of what makes us unique. It's like a little bit of chaos is actually necessary for all this order and complexity we see around us.
Exactly. It's kind of a reminder that even though things often feel predetermined, there's always room for chance, for unexpected things to happen. And maybe that's what makes life so interesting.
I know, I'm definitely looking at things a little differently after this deep dive. It's amazing to think that something we usually think of as being disruptive, randomness, is actually such a fundamental force in shaping who we are.
It's true. And we're still figuring out all the ways that nature uses these algorithms. I mean, who knows what other surprising things we'll discover as we learn more about how biology, complexity, and chance all come together.
Well, thank you so much for guiding us through this incredible topic. And to everyone listening, we hope this deep dive got you thinking and maybe even left you with a little sense of wonder about all the hidden forces that shape our world. Until next time, keep exploring and keep